The morning of Michael's wedding, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, adjusting a tie that had hung unworn in my closet for 3 years. Navy blue with thin silver stripes. Margaret had picked it out for our anniversary dinner at the Riverside Inn. "It brings out your eyes," she'd said, standing behind me in this same mirror, her hand smoothing the fabric against my chest. Now her reflection was gone, but the tie remained, and somehow wearing it made me feel less alone. I'd gotten up at 5:30, same as always. Old habits from 40 years of construction work don't die just because you retire. The coffee maker gurgled to life in the kitchen while I sat at the table, staring at the wedding invitation propped against the salt shaker. "Michael David Harrison and Jennifer Marie Caldwell request the honor of your presence." The cardstock was thick, expensive, with gold lettering that caught the morning light. Jennifer's doing, no doubt. Michael never cared about such things when he was younger. The drive to St. Matthew's Episcopal took 23 minutes through Saturday morning traffic. I'd made the same route countless times over the years. Michael's soccer games, school plays, that awful night when he broke his arm falling off the Henderson's fence. But today felt different. Today I was driving to watch my only child marry a woman I barely knew, in front of people who looked at me like I was a relic from his past, rather than the man who'd raised him. St. Matthew's sat on a hill overlooking the river, its stone facade weathered but dignified. Cars lined both sides of Elm Street, BMWs, Mercedes, a few Audis scattered among them. I parked my 15-year-old Ford between a gleaming Lexus and a Cadillac that probably cost more than I'd made in 3 months back when I was swinging a hammer for a living. The disparity wasn't lost on me, but Margaret had always said pride was a luxury we couldn't afford. "Hold your head high, Thomas," I could almost hear her whisper as I walked up the stone steps. "You built a good life with your hands." Inside, the sanctuary smelled of lilies and old wood polish. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting everything in soft blues and golds. I'd attended enough weddings in this church to know the rhythm. Bride's seat left, groom's right, families in the first few rows. But when I approached the front, looking for my designated spot, the usher, a young man in a rented tuxedo who couldn't have been older than 25, stopped me with a polite but firm hand on my arm. "I'm sorry, sir, but are you family or friend of the bride?" The question hit me like cold water. I straightened my shoulders and kept my voice level. "I'm the father of the groom." He blinked, glanced down at his clipboard, then back at me with obvious confusion. "Oh, let me check with..." He gestured vaguely toward the front of the church, where I could see Jennifer's parents holding court in the first row, her mother adjusting the flower arrangements with the precision of a military operation. "Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from." I waited while he scurried off, hands clasped behind my back, watching the church fill with faces I didn't recognize. Michael's college friends, I assumed, Jennifer's extended family, colleagues from his law firm, people who knew this version of my son, the one in tailored suits and Italian shoes, the one who sent Christmas cards with photos of him and Jennifer skiing in Aspen or touring European vineyards. The usher returned, still looking uncomfortable. "If you could just, there's a seat reserved for you in the 4th row, sir. On the right side. 4th row. Behind Michael's college roommates and law school buddies. Behind people who had known him for 5 years instead of 28. I nodded and took my seat, the wooden pew hard against my back. From here, I could see the top of my son's head as he stood at the altar, his shoulders straight in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than my monthly pension. His hair was styled differently than I remembered, shorter, more polished. When had he stopped looking like the boy who used to help me change oil in the garage on Saturday mornings? The wedding march began, and everyone stood. Jennifer appeared at the back of the church in a dress that looked like it belonged in a magazine, all silk and lace and tiny buttons that must have taken an hour to fasten. She was beautiful, I had to admit, the kind of beautiful that turned heads and made men straighten their ties. But as she walked down the aisle, her eyes never strayed from Michael. Not once did she glance toward the 4th row where his father sat alone. The ceremony proceeded with episcopal formality. Vows were exchanged, words about love and honor and cherishing that sounded rehearsed and perfect. Michael's voice was strong and confident when he said, "I do." But there was something in it I couldn't identify. Relief, maybe, or satisfaction. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, the applause was polite and enthusiastic. I clapped along with everyone else, but my hands felt heavy. At the reception, held in the church's fellowship hall, I found myself seated at table 8. Not with family. That table was reserved for Jennifer's parents, her siblings, and what appeared to be her closest aunts and uncles. Table 8 held Michael's co-workers from the firm, their wives discussing vacation homes and private school options for their children. I made conversation when spoken to, but mostly I watched. Michael and Jennifer moved through the room like celebrities, stopping at each table to thank their guests. The photographer captured every moment: the cake cutting, the first dance, the traditional bouquet toss. When they reached table 8, Michael shook hands with his colleagues while Jennifer smiled and complimented the women on their dresses. When Michael's eyes met mine, he paused. "Dad," he said, and for just a moment his voice carried the same warmth I remembered from childhood. "Thank you for being here." I stood, intending to embrace him the way fathers and sons do at weddings, but he extended his hand instead, and we shook like business associates closing a deal. Jennifer stood beside him, her smile never wavering, but her eyes were calculating in a way that made my chest tighten. "It's a beautiful wedding," I said, "because that's what you're supposed to say." "Jennifer planned everything," Michael replied, his arm sliding around his new wife's waist. "She has exquisite taste. Your mother would have loved to see this," I added quietly, thinking of the empty chair beside me, the woman who should have been dabbing her eyes with tissues and fussing over her son's appearance. Michael's smile flickered. Jennifer's grip tightened on his arm. "Well," she said brightly, "we should probably keep moving. So many guests to thank." They moved on to the next table, leaving me standing alone with my half-empty champagne glass and the distinct feeling that I'd said something wrong. I sat back down, watching as they laughed with Jennifer's cousins, as her mother pulled them aside for more photographs, as her father clapped Michael on the back, like he was welcoming him into the family. Later, during the speeches, Jennifer's father spoke about gaining a son, about the young man who'd proven himself worthy of his daughter's love. Michael's best man, someone I'd never met, told stories about their law school adventures and European trips. When the microphone was passed around for family toasts, it went from Jennifer's mother to her siblings to her grandparents. It never came to table 8. I realized, sitting there in my 3-year-old tie and 15-year-old suit, that I wasn't family anymore. I was a guest, a courtesy invitation, a box checked on a wedding planning list. The band started playing again, and couples took to the dance floor. Michael spun Jennifer in circles while her dress flared around her like something from a fairy tale. I watched them dance, these two beautiful young people who seemed to exist in a world I'd never been invited to join. When the song ended, Michael walked over to his new in-laws table, bending to whisper something in Jennifer's father's ear that made the older man laugh and nod approvingly. That's when it happened, the moment that would replay in my mind for months afterward. I was standing by the bar, nursing a club soda and watching the festivities, when Michael approached. His tie was loosened now, his hair slightly mussed from dancing. He looked like the boy I'd raised, but when he spoke, his voice belonged to a stranger. "Dad, we need to talk." He guided me toward a quieter corner of the reception hall, away from the music and laughter. "Jennifer and I have been discussing our future, and we think it would be best if you understood where things stand." I waited, sensing something in his tone that made my stomach clench. "You're not family anymore," he said, his eyes meeting mine with a steadiness that was somehow worse than anger. "I mean, biologically, sure, but family is about more than blood. It's about being part of something bigger, something that moves forward together. And honestly, Dad, you've been stuck in the past since Mom died." The words hit me like a physical blow. I gripped my glass tighter, feeling the condensation slip between my fingers. "Michael, I'm not saying this to hurt you," he continued, though his voice held no particular warmth. "I'm saying it because I need you to understand. This is my life now. Jennifer's family, they get it. They understand what it takes to build something meaningful, to be successful. They don't live in the past." I thought about the lake house Margaret and I had bought when Michael was 12, the summers we'd spent there, teaching him to fish and sail, the Christmas mornings by the stone fireplace I'd built with my own hands, the photo albums filled with pictures of birthday parties and little league games and family vacations. All of that was the past, apparently. All of that was holding him back. "Your mother," I started to say, but he cut me off. "Mom's been gone for 3 years, Dad. It's time to let go." He walked away then, back into his new wife and her family, back to the life he'd chosen that apparently had no room for the man who had raised him. I stood alone in that corner, watching the reception continue around me, feeling like I'd been erased from my own son's story. I left before the cake cutting, slipping out through a side door, while the photographer was arranging group shots that I hadn't been asked to join. The night air was cool against my face as I walked to my Ford, past all those expensive cars that belonged to people who'd claimed my son more thoroughly than I'd ever managed to. The drive home took the same 23 minutes, but everything looked different in the darkness. Streetlights cast long shadows across empty intersections. The radio played soft jazz that reminded me of dancing with Margaret in our kitchen on Sunday mornings, both of us still in our bathrobes, the coffee growing cold on the counter. When I pulled into my driveway, the motion sensor light flickered on, illuminating the garage door I'd painted last spring and the flower beds Margaret had planted before she got sick. The house looked smaller somehow, more fragile in the artificial light. I sat in the car for a few minutes, engine ticking as it cooled, trying to process what had happened. My son had married a beautiful woman in a beautiful ceremony surrounded by people who loved him, and somehow I was no longer one of them. Inside, I hung my tie on the bedroom doorknob and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the framed photo on Margaret's nightstand. It was from Michael's high school graduation, the three of us standing together in the gymnasium, his arms around both our shoulders, all of us grinning at the camera. He'd been so proud that day, so grateful for everything we'd done to get him there. "You're not family anymore," the words echoed in the quiet house, bouncing off walls that held 28 years of memories, settling into corners where Christmas mornings and birthday celebrations and ordinary Tuesday night dinners had once filled the space with warmth and laughter. I thought about calling someone, my brother in Kansas City maybe, or my old foreman Jim who'd retired the same year I did. But what would I say? That my son had cut me loose at his own wedding? That I'd somehow become a stranger in my own family? Instead, I sat alone in the dark, still wearing my wedding clothes, trying to understand when exactly I'd lost my place in Michael's life, and wondering if there was any way to earn it back. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, marking the end of what should have been one of the happiest days of my life. Tomorrow, I knew, would bring the real test. Tomorrow, I'd have to figure out how to live as a father whose son no longer claimed him. But tonight, I just sat with the weight of it all, holding Margaret's photograph and wishing she were here to tell me what to do next. The morning after the wedding arrived, gray and cold, with the kind of October wind that finds every gap in your windows and reminds you that winter isn't asking permission to come early. I woke at 5:30, my body's internal clock still set to construction crew hours, and lay in bed listening to the house settle around me. Without Margaret's breathing beside me, without the rustle of her turning pages in whatever mystery novel she was reading, the silence felt absolute. I made coffee in the kitchen, standing at the counter while it brewed, staring out at the backyard Margaret had spent 15 years perfecting. Her rose bushes were still blooming, late pink flowers that would die with the first hard frost. I'd promised to maintain her garden after she passed, but lately I'd been letting things slide. The grass needed cutting, the flower beds needed weeding, and the bird feeders she'd insisted on hanging from every available tree branch were empty. The garage called to me, the way it always did when my mind was too loud. I pulled on my work clothes, jeans soft from decades of washing, a flannel shirt that smelled faintly of sawdust no matter how many times I laundered it, and walked out through the kitchen door. The overhead fluorescent buzzed to life, illuminating my workbench exactly as I'd left it 3 months ago. Tools arranged by size and function, coffee cans filled with sorted screws and bolts, the pegboard where Margaret had outlined each tool's place with a black marker so I'd know where everything belonged. "You're too organized for your own good, Tom," she used to tease. "What happens when you can't find something because it's exactly where it's supposed to be?" I picked up a chisel, testing its edge against my thumb, still sharp, still ready for work that might never come. Since retiring 5 years ago, I'd built birdhouses for the church auction, repaired neighbors' fences without being asked, and spent countless hours in here just because it was the only place that still felt like mine. The blue Ford sat in the far bay, its hood open from last week's oil change. I'd been meaning to replace the air filter, one of those small maintenance tasks that Margaret used to remind me about. "The car won't take care of itself," she'd say, usually while handing me a list of other things that needed attention. Now the list maker was gone, and the car waited patiently for care that came only when I remembered to give it. I was elbow deep in the engine compartment when my phone rang, The sound echoed off the concrete walls, sharp and insistent. I wiped my hands on a shop rag and pulled the phone from my pocket, squinting at the screen. Michael's name glowed against the black background. For a moment, I just stared at it. After yesterday's declaration that I wasn't family anymore, I hadn't expected to hear from him this soon. Maybe he had had time to think about what he'd said. Maybe the morning had brought regret and an apology. Maybe... "Hello, Michael." "Dad." His voice was crisp, businesslike, no warmth, no acknowledgement of yesterday's hurt. "Jennifer and I are driving up to the lake house this morning. We need to talk." The lake house? The place Margaret and I had bought when Michael was 12, a modest A-frame on 30 acres of woods and water an hour north of the city. We'd spent every summer there, every holiday, every weekend we could manage. Michael had learned to swim off that dock, had caught his first bass from the old rowboat Margaret insisted on keeping, despite its tendency to leak. It was where we'd been happiest as a family. "Talk about what?" I asked, though something in his tone already told me I wouldn't like the answer. "About arrangements, about what makes sense going forward." A pause, then, "About the property." The property. Not the lake house, or our place, or any of the dozen affectionate names we'd used over the years. The property, like it was just another asset to be managed. "I'll be there in an hour," I said. "Actually, Dad, it would be better if you gave us some space today. We need time to discuss things privately, as a married couple. You understand." I understood perfectly. I understood that my son and his new wife wanted to walk through the house Margaret and I had filled with memories, to evaluate it like potential buyers rather than family members returning home. "It's my house, Michael." "Is it?" His voice carried a note I'd never heard before. Not quite challenge, not quite threat, but something that made my grip tighten on the phone. "Because Jennifer's father knows some excellent real estate attorneys. They've explained to us how these things usually work when someone gets older, when they start having trouble managing multiple properties." The implication hung in the air like smoke. I was getting older. I might start having trouble. And when that happened, decisions might need to be made for me rather than by me. "I'm 70 years old, not 90, I said quietly, "and I'm not having trouble managing anything." "Of course not. But Dad, you have to think practically. You're living alone in a house that's too big for one person, and you've got this second property sitting empty 90% of the time. It doesn't make sense financially." Financially. As if the lake house was an investment portfolio, rather than the place where Margaret had read bedtime stories to young Michael, where we'd taught him to build fires and identify constellations, where she'd insisted on planting wildflowers because every view needs something beautiful that doesn't require permission to grow. "We'll talk when I get there," I said. "Dad, I really think..." I hung up. The garage fell silent except for the fluorescent's persistent buzz and the tick of the Ford's cooling engine. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the phone in my hand, processing what had just happened. My son had essentially told me to stay away from my own property while he and his wife decided its fate. Margaret's voice echoed in my memory, something she'd said during one of our last conversations when the morphine was making her words soft, but her thoughts sharp. "Don't let anyone take what we built together, Tom. Not even him." I'd promised her I wouldn't. At the time, I'd thought she was talking about strangers, con artists who prey on widowers, or lawyers who convince old men to make foolish decisions. I'd never imagined she might have been warning me about our own son. I closed the Ford's hood and walked back into the house. In the kitchen, Margaret's coffee mug still sat in the cabinet where I'd placed it 3 years ago, unwashed and untouched. A shrine to routine, to the woman who had started every morning with Earl Grey tea and ended every evening with chamomile. The mug was white ceramic with pink roses, chipped along the rim from years of use. She'd refused to throw it away. "It has character," she'd say, tracing the crack with her finger. The lake house was an hour and 15 minutes north, through rolling farmland that had been subdivided into housing developments over the past decade. I'd driven this route so many times I could navigate it blind, past the old Miller farm that was now Meadowbrook Estates, past the defunct gas station that marked the halfway point, past the antique store where Margaret used to stop to browse furniture she had no intention of buying. The gravel driveway crunched under my tires as I pulled up to the A-frame. Michael's BMW was already there, parked beside Jennifer's white Lexus. Both vehicles looked out of place against the rustic backdrop of pine trees and native stone. Through the living room's picture window, I could see movement. figures walking through rooms, examining, evaluating. I sat in my truck for a moment, engine off, keys in my lap. This place had been our sanctuary. The kitchen where Margaret made blueberry pancakes on Sunday mornings. The living room where we'd played board games during thunderstorms. The deck where we'd shared evening cocktails and watched the sunset over water that reflected the sky like polished glass. Now it felt like I was visiting someone else's property. I climbed the front steps, noting that the loose board I'd been meaning to fix was still loose, and opened the door. The scent hit me immediately. Margaret's lavender sachets, wood smoke from fires long cold, and something else I couldn't identify. Change, maybe. The smell of a place being mentally redecorated. Dad? Michael appeared from the kitchen, Jennifer close behind him. She'd changed from her wedding gown into designer jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Her smile was bright and empty. Michael, Jennifer. I stepped inside, noting how they positioned themselves, not beside each other, but between me and the rest of the house, like guards at a checkpoint. We were just looking around, Jennifer said, her voice carrying the kind of brightness people use when they're trying to smooth over uncomfortable situations. It's really quite charming, isn't it? Very rustic. Rustic. The word dripped with condescension. This wasn't rustic, it was home. Every board, every stone, every carefully chosen detail had been selected by Margaret and installed by my hands. The kitchen cabinets I'd built from scratch. The stone fireplace that had taken me 3 weekends to complete. The deck where we'd hosted Michael's friends for birthday parties and graduation celebrations. Your mother loved this place, I said, running my hand along the back of the sofa where Margaret used to curl up with her books. Mom loved a lot of things, Michael replied, his tone suggesting that loving things was a weakness rather than a virtue. But love doesn't pay property taxes or maintenance costs. Jennifer moved to the window overlooking the lake, her gaze assessing rather than appreciative. The location is wonderful, of course, but the house itself is quite dated. It would need significant updates to be marketable. Marketable. My stomach dropped as the word's implications sank in. Nobody said anything about selling, I said carefully. Michael and Jennifer exchanged a look, one of those married couple communications that happens without words. She nodded slightly, giving him permission to proceed. Dad, sit down, please. I remained standing. I'm fine where I am. Look, this is hard for both of us, Michael began, adopting the patient tone lawyers use with difficult clients. But you have to face reality. You're 70 years old, living alone, trying to maintain 2 properties on a pension that barely covers one. It's not sustainable. I'm managing just fine. Are you? Jennifer stepped forward, her voice soft but insistent. When was the last time you were here? Really spent time here, not just driving up to check on things? The question stung because the answer was months. Since Margaret's death, the lake house had felt more like a museum than a retreat. Too many memories, too much emptiness. But that didn't mean I was ready to let it go. That's not the point, I said. It's exactly the point, Michael replied. You're letting sentiment cloud your judgment. This property could set you up financially for the rest of your life. You could move into one of those nice senior communities, have people around, activities, medical care nearby if you need it. A senior community, assisted living disguised as lifestyle choice. I'd visited enough of those places when Margaret's friends started dying off. Beige walls, scheduled activities, the smell of industrial disinfectant and resignation. This house is paid for, I said. Has been for 8 years. No mortgage, no debt. Why would I trade that for monthly fees I can't afford? Because, Jennifer said, moving closer, her perfume sharp in the close air, sometimes what we can afford isn't the same as what's best for us. I looked at my son, really looked at him. The boy who'd helped me install the kitchen sink, who'd handed me tools while I built the deck, who'd carved his initials in the oak tree out back when he was 14. That boy was gone, replaced by this stranger in expensive clothes who spoke about my life like it was a problem to be solved. Get out, I said quietly. Dad, get out of my house, both of you. Michael's jaw tightened. This is exactly what we're talking about. You're being irrational, emotional. You can't think clearly about what's best for you. What's best for me is having a son who respects me. What's best for me is not being treated like a burden or an obstacle. I moved toward the door, opening it wide. What's best for me is you leaving, now. They left, but not before Jennifer placed a business card on the kitchen counter. "When you're ready to be reasonable," she said, her voice no longer bright, "call us." I waited until their cars disappeared down the driveway before closing the door. The house felt different now, not empty, but violated. They had walked through it with calculating eyes, pricing fixtures, and evaluating square footage, reducing 30 years of memories to market value. I picked up Jennifer's business card, Caldwell & Associates, Real Estate Development. At the bottom, in smaller print, specializing in estate transitions and senior property management. Estate transitions, senior property management. The language of people who made careers out of convincing old men to give up everything they'd worked for. I tore the card in half, then in half again, and dropped the pieces in the kitchen trash. But as I stood there, looking out at the lake where Margaret and I had shared countless sunsets, I realized that destroying the card wouldn't destroy the problem. Michael and Jennifer weren't going away. They'd made their intentions clear, and they'd be back with lawyers and documentation and all the professional pressure that money could buy. The drive home felt longer than usual. Every mile stretched like a year, giving me time to think about what Margaret would have done in this situation. She'd been the diplomat in our family, the one who could diffuse Michael's teenage tantrums with a combination of firmness and understanding. She'd known how to reach him when I couldn't, how to translate my practical concerns into language he could accept. But Margaret was gone, and I was on my own. Back in my garage that evening, I pulled out a yellow legal pad and sat on the old wooden stool where I used to plan construction projects. At the top of the page, I wrote, "Options." Underneath, I began making a list. 1. Sell the lake house. Give them what they want. 2. Fight in a court. Expensive, uncertain outcome. 3. Transfer ownership, trust, charity, other arrangements. Wait and see. Hope they lose interest. Make it harder for them to take. I stared at the list for a long time, Margaret's voice in my memory. "Sometimes the best defense is a good offense, Tom. Don't wait for trouble to find you. Go meet it on your own terms." Option 5 began to take shape in my mind. I'd spent 40 years building things, solving problems, outmaneuvering competitors who thought they could push around an old contractor. Maybe it was time to remind my son that his father hadn't survived 4 decades in business by being weak. I walked to the metal cabinet where I kept important papers, tax returns, insurance policies, and the deed to the lake house. Margaret's name was on it too, of course, but her death certificate had transferred full ownership to me. Clear title, no liens, no legal complications, but legal complications could be created if someone knew how. The phone rang as I was locking the cabinet. Michael's number again. "Dad, I think we got off on the wrong foot today. Jennifer feels terrible about how things ended." I doubted that, but I kept my voice neutral. "Do you?" "Of course I do. Look, why don't you come to dinner tomorrow night? We can discuss this like adults, figure out what works for everyone." "What works for everyone, or what works for you?" A pause. "Dad, you're making this harder than it needs to be. We're trying to help you. By taking my property, by helping you make smart decisions while you still can. While you still can." The words hung in the air like a threat dressed up as concern. The implication was clear. Soon, I might not be capable of making my own decisions. Soon, someone else might need to make them for me. "I'll think about it," I said, and hung up before he could respond. That night, I sat in Margaret's chair, the blue recliner positioned to look out at the bird feeders, and tried to remember when exactly Michael had stopped being the boy who'd spent summer afternoons helping me rebuild the dock at the lake house. When had his questions changed from, "Can you show me how to do that?" to, "Why are you still doing that?" Maybe it was college, when he'd discovered there was a world beyond our small town, one where success was measured in salary figures rather than honest work. Maybe it was law school, where he'd learned to see relationships as transactions and problems as puzzles to be solved through leverage and maneuvering. Or maybe it was Margaret's illness. The memory hit me like a physical blow. Those last 6 months, when the cancer had taken her strength, but not her spirit, when she'd insisted on spending as much time as possible at the lake house, despite the difficulty of the drive. Michael had visited exactly twice during that period, both times bringing Jennifer, both times staying less than an hour. "I can't handle seeing her like this," he had confessed during that second visit, standing on the deck while Margaret napped inside. It's too hard. I'd wanted to tell him that watching your wife die was harder than visiting her, that being 1,200 miles away in law school didn't exempt him from family responsibility. But Margaret had asked me to be patient with him, to understand that people process grief differently. Now I wondered if what I'd mistaken for grief had actually been calculation. Had he been mentally inventorying the property even then, deciding what he'd want to keep and what he'd want to liquidate? The grandfather clock chimed 9 times. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley. I thought about the dinner invitation, about sitting across from Michael and Jennifer while they explained why giving up my life's work was actually in my best interest. I thought about Margaret's garden, slowly dying from neglect. I thought about the lake house, sitting empty under autumn stars. And I thought about the yellow legal pad in the garage, where option 5 waited to be explored. Don't forget to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement means everything to us. By 10 o'clock, I'd made my decision. Tomorrow night, I'd go to dinner. I'd listen to their proposal with the polite attention they expected. I'd nod at appropriate moments and ask reasonable questions. But I wouldn't sign anything, and I wouldn't agree to anything. Because while they'd been planning this conversation, assuming I'd be too grief-stricken and lonely to resist their logic, I'd been remembering something Margaret used to say about chess. The game isn't won by the player with the best pieces. It's won by the player who sees the most moves ahead. I was about to start seeing very far ahead indeed. The dinner invitation came with an address I had to look up on the old road atlas Margaret kept in the glove compartment. Whitmore Estates, a gated community 20 minutes south of the city, where every house looked like it had been designed by the same architect and approved by the same committee. I pulled up to the security gate at exactly 6 o'clock, my Ford looking shabby beside the Audis and Mercedeses idling ahead of me. The guard, a young man in a crisp uniform, leaned down to my window. "Name and destination, sir?" "Thomas Harrison, visiting Michael and Jennifer Harrison, 47 Maple Ridge Drive." He consulted his clipboard, made a check mark, and handed me a temporary pass. "Follow Whitmore Boulevard to the second roundabout, then left on Maple Ridge. Speed limit is 15 miles per hour. 15 miles per hour. In a community where the lawns were so perfect they looked artificial, and every driveway was pressure washed to showroom condition. I drove slowly through streets named after trees that had probably been cut down to build the place, past houses that looked expensive but somehow temporary, like movie sets waiting to be struck. Number 47 sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, a colonial revival with white columns and black shutters. 2 stories, probably 4 bedrooms, with a 3-car garage and landscaping that had never known weeds. Michael's BM and Jennifer's Lexus were parked in the circular drive like bookends. I pulled up behind them, noting that my Ford left a small oil stain on their pristine pavement. Jennifer answered the door before I could knock. She'd changed from her casual clothes into what I assumed was her idea of relaxed elegance. Silk blouse, tailored pants, jewelry that caught the porch light and threw it back in calculated sparkles. "Thomas!" She embraced me with the kind of enthusiasm people reserve for distant relatives at funerals. "Thank you so much for coming. We're so excited to have you here." The house smelled like vanilla candles and new carpet. The foyer opened into a living room that looked like a furniture showroom. Everything coordinated, nothing personal, no sign that actual people lived here. The coffee table held architectural magazines fanned out in a perfect display. The mantelpiece showcased silver-framed photographs of Michael and Jennifer at various exotic locations, always smiling, always perfectly posed. "Your home is lovely," I said, because politeness was a habit Margaret had drilled into me over 43 years of marriage. "Thank you. We're still settling in, of course. The decorator says it takes at least 6 months to get everything just right." Jennifer guided me toward the kitchen, where something that smelled like rosemary and garlic was making my stomach remember what appetite felt like. Michael appeared from what I assumed was his home office, wearing the kind of casual clothes that probably cost more than my good suit. Khakis with creases sharp enough to cut paper, a button-down shirt that had never seen the inside of a regular washing machine. "Dad." He shook my hand the same way he had at the wedding, formal, distant, like we were meeting for the first time. "Thanks for driving out. I know it's a bit of a trek from your place." The dining room table was set for 3, but only 2 of the place settings had wine glasses. A small detail, but one that told me they'd done their homework. They knew about my heart medication, knew I couldn't drink alcohol anymore. The consideration might have touched me if it hadn't felt so calculated. Dinner was lamb with rosemary, roasted vegetables, and conversation that felt like a job interview. They asked about my health, my daily routine, how I was managing the house maintenance and yard work. Innocent questions on the surface, but I'd negotiated enough contracts to recognize information gathering when I heard it. "The house in town is quite large for one person," Jennifer observed, cutting her lamb into precise, identical pieces. 5 bedrooms, wasn't it? That's a lot of space to heat and maintain. "I grew up in that house," I said. "Margaret and I raised Michael there. It's not about square footage." "Of course not," Michael said quickly. "But, Dad, you have to admit it's impractical. When was the last time you used the upstairs bedrooms? Or the formal dining room?" I thought about the master bedroom where Margaret had died, about the guest rooms we'd prepared hopefully for grandchildren who'd never come, about the dining room where we'd hosted Christmas dinners for 20 years. Empty didn't mean meaningless. "I use what I need," I said. "But think about what you could do with the equity," Jennifer leaned forward, her eyes bright with evangelical fervor. "You could buy a beautiful condo downtown, something modern and efficient. No yard work, no maintenance, building security. And with what's left over from both sales, you'd have a substantial nest egg. Both sales, lake house and family home, they wanted everything." I set down my fork and looked at my son. "Michael, do you remember building the treehouse behind the garage when you were 10? His expression shifted, surprise flickering across his face. "What does that have to do with anything?" "You insisted on using real lumber, not plywood. Said if we were going to build something, it should last. We spent 3 weekends on that project, measuring, cutting, hammering every nail by hand. You were so proud when we finished." "Dad, do you remember what you said when Jimmy Patterson offered to buy it from you for $50? Michael's jaw tightened. Jennifer looked between us, sensing the conversation had moved beyond her control. "You said some things weren't for sale," I continued. "You said it wasn't about money. It was about the work we'd done together, the time we'd spent. You couldn't sell that to someone else because they'd never understand what it meant." The silence stretched across the table like a chasm. Outside, the manicured darkness of Whitmore Estates pressed against the windows. No crickets, no night sounds. Even the insects had been gentrified out of this place. "That was different," Michaelette said finally. "I was a kid." "Yes, you were. But you understood something then that you seem to have forgotten. Some things matter more than their cash value." Jennifer's smile had become fixed, plastic. "Thomas, I think there's been a misunderstanding about our intentions. We're not suggesting you sell these properties for our benefit. We're concerned about your welfare, your future security." "Are you?" I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, the one she'd left at the lake house yesterday. "Caldwell and Associates, Real Estate Development, specializing in estate transitions and senior property management." I set it on the table between us. "This is your family's company, isn't it?" The color drained from Jennifer's face. Michael's fork clattered against his plate. "How did you—" she started, then stopped herself. "I may be old," I said quietly, "but I'm not stupid. I spent 40 years dealing with people who wanted to buy what I wasn't selling. I know what a setup looks like." Michael found his voice first. "Dad, you're being paranoid. Yes, Jennifer's family is in real estate. That doesn't mean— It means you married into a family that makes money by convincing people like me to give up properties like mine. It means this whole dinner, this whole conversation, is a sales pitch." I stood up, placing my napkin beside my barely touched plate. "Thank you for dinner. It was very educational." "Dad, wait." Michael rose too, his chair scraping against the hardwood. "You're misunderstanding the situation. We're trying to help you plan for the future." "Whose future? Mine or yours?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Through the kitchen doorway, I could see a stack of documents on the counter. Legal papers, property assessments, forms with my name printed at the top. They had been preparing for this conversation longer than I'd realized. "I'll see myself out," I said. The drive home took 25 minutes through darkness that felt deeper than usual. Every streetlight seemed dimmer, every familiar landmark somehow changed. By the time I pulled into my own driveway, the motion sensor casting its reliable circle of light across the garage door, I felt like I'd aged 10 years in a single evening. Inside, I made a cup of coffee I didn't want, and sat at the kitchen table with the yellow legal pad I'd started the night before. Under option 5, make it harder for them to take, I began writing in earnest. First, documentation. I needed to establish a clear record of my mental competency, my financial stability, my ability to manage my own affairs. Doctor visits, bank statements, maintenance records for both properties. If they were planning to challenge my decision-making capacity, I'd make sure the evidence showed otherwise. Second, legal protection. I needed a lawyer who understood elder law, someone who could help me structure my affairs in ways that would make hostile takeover difficult or impossible. Trust funds, charitable donations, irrevocable transfers, tools I'd heard about but never needed to use. Third, security, physical and digital, cameras, locks, document safes. If they were willing to deceive me at dinner, they might be willing to go further. I needed to protect not just my property, but my privacy. I wrote until nearly midnight, filling 3 pages with plans, contacts, and timelines. When I finally put down the pen, something had shifted inside me. The hurt was still there, the betrayal of watching my son reduce our relationship to a business transaction. But underneath it was something steadier and more useful: resolve. Margaret had always said I was at my best when I had a project to focus on, a problem to solve with my hands and my head. Well, now I had the biggest project of my life, protecting everything we'd built together from the son who should have been its guardian. If you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button. We've got more family drama coming your way. I closed the legal pad and walked through the house, turning off lights, checking locks, performing the small rituals that marked the end of another day. In the master bedroom, I paused before Margaret's dresser, where her jewelry box still sat undisturbed, her perfume bottles still arranged the way she'd left them. "They want to take it all," I said to her photograph. "The lake house, this place, everything we worked for." The photograph didn't answer, but I could imagine what she'd say. Margaret had never been one to back down from a fight, especially when the stakes mattered. She'd fought the insurance company when they'd tried to deny coverage for my heart surgery. She'd fought the city council when they'd wanted to put a strip mall where the old Miller farm used to be. She'd fought her cancer with grace and determination until the very end. Now it was my turn to fight. The next morning brought the first frost of the season, silver crystals covering Margaret's roses like nature's own jewelry. I made my coffee and sat at the kitchen table, watching the sun burn away the frost one blade of grass at a time. By 8 o'clock, I was dressed and ready to begin what Margaret would have called a proper campaign. First stop, Dr. Patricia Williams, who'd been my physician for 12 years. Her office smelled like antiseptic and patience, with magazines that were only 6 months out of date and chairs designed by someone who had never had to sit in them for more than 5 minutes. "Tom," she said when I was called back, "this is a pleasant surprise. Feeling all right?" "Fine, but I need a favor, Pat. I need a complete physical and cognitive evaluation. Everything you can test." Her eyebrows rose slightly. "Any particular reason? You seem perfectly healthy for a man your age. Someone's questioning whether I'm competent to manage my own affairs. I want documentation that says otherwise." She studied my face the way doctors do when they're reading between the lines. "Family issues? You could say that. The examination took 2 hours. Blood work, EKG, memory tests, balance assessments, cognitive function evaluations. When we finished, Dr. Williams sat across from me in her office, my chart open on her desk. "Tom, your physical health is excellent. Your heart condition is well managed, your reflexes are good, and your cognitive function tests in the 95th percentile for your age group. If someone is suggesting you're not capable of independent living, they're either misinformed or deliberately misleading." I requested copies of everything: test results, evaluation summaries, her professional opinion in writing. Insurance would cover most of it, and what it didn't cover was worth every penny. Next stop, First National Bank, where I'd done business for 27 years. Margaret and I had been conservative with money, saving steadily, avoiding debt, building the kind of financial foundation that let us sleep peacefully even during economic downturns. Janet Morrison, the branch manager, pulled my accounts up on her computer and smiled. "Mr. Harrison, you're in excellent financial shape. Better than most people half your age. Is there something specific you're concerned about? I want to make sure no one else can access my accounts. No family members, no emergency contacts, just me." Her smile faded slightly. Of course. Is there a reason you are worried about unauthorized access? Call it an abundance of caution. We spent an hour updating my account security, adding password requirements, establishing verbal confirmation protocols for any large transactions. When we finished, my financial privacy was as secure as modern banking could make it. The drive to Marcus Henley's law office took me through the older part of town, past the high school where Michael had played baseball, past the church where Margaret and I had been married 43 years ago. Marcus had handled our real estate transactions, our wills, and the legal work for my construction business. He was my age, maybe a year younger, with the kind of sharp mind that had served him well in a career built on paying attention to details others missed. "Tom," he said when his secretary showed me into his office, "good to see you, though I suspect this isn't a social call." I told him everything: the wedding, the lake house confrontation, the dinner conversation, Jennifer's business card. Marcus listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on the same yellow legal pads I favored. "They can't force you to sell," he said when I finished. "Not legally, but they can make your life difficult if they're determined enough." "How?" "Emotional pressure, financial pressure, if they can find leverage. Adult children have been known to claim their parents are no longer competent to make decisions about their own welfare." The words hit like ice water. They'd try to have me declared incompetent? It's not uncommon, harder to prove than most people think, especially if the alleged incompetent person has good legal representation and current medical documentation. He smiled slightly. "Which you do." We spent the rest of the afternoon discussing options: living trusts, charitable donations, property transfers that would make hostile action difficult or impossible. By the time I left Marcus's office, I had a clear understanding of the legal battlefield and several potential strategies for controlling it. The sun was setting when I pulled into my driveway, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me of autumn evenings with Margaret. She'd love this time of day, insisting we sit on the front porch even when the air was too cold for comfort. "The light is different now," she'd say, "softer, like the world is getting ready to rest." Tonight, the light felt different for another reason. It felt like the last peaceful evening I'd have for a while. Inside, I made a simple dinner: grilled cheese and tomato soup, comfort food that tasted like childhood. While I ate, I reviewed the notes I'd taken during my meeting with Marcus. The legal protections were clear, but they'd take time to implement. Trusts needed to be drafted and funded. Property transfers required appraisals and documentation. Medical evaluations had to be scheduled and completed. Time I might not have if Michael and Jennifer decided to escalate their pressure campaign. The phone rang as I was washing my dishes. Michael's number. "Dad, Jennifer wanted me to call and apologize for last night. She feels like we may have come across as insensitive." "Did you feel that way too?" A pause. "I think we all want the same thing. What's best for you. Sometimes it's hard to separate emotions from practical considerations." "And what are the practical considerations exactly?" "You're living alone in houses that are too big, too expensive to maintain properly. You're isolated, especially at the lake. What if something happened? What if you fell or had another heart episode and there was no one around to help?" I dried the coffee mug slowly, considering my response. "Michael, in 40 years of construction work, I learned something important about foundations. The stronger they are, the longer everything built on them will last. Your mother and I built strong foundations: financial, emotional, practical. I'm not crumbling just because I'm 70. I know that, but Dad, planning ahead isn't admitting weakness, it's being responsible. Responsible to whom?" Another pause, longer this time. "To your family, to the people who care about you." "And who would that be exactly? The son who told me I wasn't family anymore? The daughter-in-law who sees my property as a business opportunity? That's not fair, isn't it?" I placed the mug in the cabinet, in the exact spot where Margaret had always kept it. "Michael, when was the last time you visited me because you wanted to see me, not because you needed something?" The silence stretched across the phone line like a distance that couldn't be measured in miles. "We'll talk soon," he said finally, and the line went dead. I stood in the kitchen, surrounded by 43 years of accumulated life. Margaret's spice rack still organized alphabetically, the refrigerator still covered with photos of Michael at various ages, the cookie jar she'd filled every Sunday with snickerdoodles, whether anyone was coming to visit or not. Tomorrow, I'd begin implementing the plans I'd made. I'd start building legal walls around what Margaret and I had created together. But tonight, I allowed myself to grieve. Not for Margaret. I'd already done that work. Already found ways to carry her memory that didn't require constant pain. Tonight I grieved for my son, for the relationship we'd never really had, for the man I'd hoped he'd become versus the one he'd actually chosen to be. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times, its voice echoing through rooms that had once been filled with family dinners and birthday celebrations and Christmas mornings. Now they held only echoes and the quiet determination of a man who'd finally stopped pretending that love alone was enough to bridge the gap between who we were and who we'd hoped to be. I turned off the lights and climbed the stairs to my bedroom, past the framed photographs that marked the passage of years. Michael's first steps, his high school graduation, his college diploma, his wedding day. In every photo, he was smiling. In most of them, so was I. But looking at them now, I could see what I'd missed at the time. The gradual change in his posture, the way his smiles had become more careful, more calculated. The distance that had grown between us year by year, conversation by conversation, until we'd become strangers who shared a name and a history, but no common understanding of what either meant. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. But tonight, I slept more soundly than I had in months, comforted by the knowledge that I was no longer waiting for the next blow to fall. I was preparing to meet it head on. And if my son thought he could outmaneuver a man who'd spent 4 decades building things to last, he was about to learn just how wrong he could be. The call came 3 days later, while I was in the garage organizing my tool cabinet, a task that didn't need doing, but gave my hands something to focus on while my mind worked through Marcus's advice about trust structures and property transfers. The phone rang sharp and insistent against the concrete walls, startling me enough that I nearly dropped the box of wood screws I'd been sorting. "Dad, we need to meet." Michael's voice carried an edge I'd heard before, usually when he was about to ask for something expensive. Today, if possible. I set the screws down carefully, buying time. "What's this about?" "The lake house. Jennifer's parents drove up there yesterday to take a look around. They're very interested in making an offer." The words hit me like a slap. "They're what?" I gave them a key so they could see the property properly. "Dad, they're offering 20% above market value. Cash deal, no financing contingencies. You'd be crazy not to consider it." I gripped the phone tighter, feeling my pulse spike in a way that would have concerned Dr. Williams. "You gave them a key to my house?" "I still have the spare from when I was a teenager." "Look, Dad, I know this is sudden, but good opportunities don't wait around. The Caldwells have been looking for a lake property for years. This could solve everyone's problems." Everyone's problems. I thought about the commission Jennifer's family would earn on a cash sale 20% above market value. I thought about the finder's fee Michael would probably collect for bringing the deal to them. I thought about the problem it would solve for a young couple who wanted their in-laws settled somewhere comfortable, but not too close. "I'm not selling the lake house." "Dad, be reasonable. You haven't spent a full week in there in over a year. It's just sitting empty, costing you money in taxes and maintenance. This way, it goes to people who will actually use it, and you get financial security." "I have financial security." "Do you? When was the last time you looked at your heating bills, your property taxes, the cost of maintaining 2 houses on a fixed income?" I had looked at those numbers, recently and carefully, during my meeting with Janet Morrison. My finances were solid, my expenses manageable, my income sufficient. But Michael was speaking as if I were one missed payment away from foreclosure. "Meet me at the lake house," I said. 1 hour. "Dad, I don't think that's necessary." 1 hour, Michael. If you want to discuss my property, we'll do it on my property." The drive north gave me time to think, to process the anger that was building in my chest like pressure in a boiler. They'd been planning this, the wedding reception, the dinner invitation, the concerned questions about my living arrangements. All of it had been leading to this moment. They'd been softening me up for weeks, like contractors who quote one price to get the job and then start finding expensive problems once the work begins. The lake house sat exactly as I'd left it after Sunday's confrontation, but something felt different. I walked around the exterior, noting fresh tire tracks in the gravel, cigarette butts by the back door that hadn't been there before. And most telling of all, the spare key wasn't where I'd hidden it 20 years ago. They'd been here all right. Not just looking around, but evaluating, measuring, probably taking photographs for the development company's files. Inside, the violation was more subtle but unmistakable. Furniture had been moved. Not much, just enough to suggest someone had been testing sightlines and room flow. Cabinet doors were closed differently than my habit. The thermostat had been adjusted. Jennifer's parents hadn't just toured the property. They'd inhabited it temporarily, imagining their belongings in place of mine and Margaret's. I was standing in the living room, processing this invasion, when I heard gravel crunching in the driveway. Michael's BM, followed by a silver Cadillac I didn't recognize. Through the front window, I watched 4 people emerge, Michael and Jennifer, and an older couple who moved with the confident ease of people accustomed to getting their way. The Caldwells, presumably, Jennifer's parents. I opened the door before they could knock, meeting them on the front porch where the wind off the lake cut through clothing and pretense alike. The older man, tall, silver-haired, wearing a sport coat that probably cost more than my truck, extended his hand with a smile that was all business. "Thomas, I'm Richard Caldwell, Jennifer's father. This is my wife, Patricia. We can't thank you enough for considering our proposal." I shook his hand without enthusiasm. "I haven't considered anything yet." Patricia Caldwell smiled with the kind of practiced warmth that real estate professionals cultivate like a professional skill. She was elegant in the way that money makes possible. Perfect hair, perfect teeth, perfect jewelry that caught the afternoon light. "What a charming property," she said, her gaze sweeping across the lake view. "So much potential." Potential, the word developers use when they mean tear down and start over. "Let's go inside," Michael said, though he waited for the Caldwells to move first, like a junior partner deferring to senior management. In the living room, they arranged themselves with choreographed precision. The Caldwells took the sofa, positioning themselves to frame the lake view. Jennifer perched on the edge of Margaret's reading chair, her posture suggesting she was ready to leap into action when needed. Michael stood by the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel, where Margaret and I had displayed 40 years of family photographs. "Thomas," Richard Caldwell began, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to closing deals, "I want you to know how much we appreciate you considering our offer. Properties like this don't come on the market often." "The property isn't on the market." His smile didn't waver. "Of course not. We're talking about a private sale between families. Much simpler that way. No realtors, no public listings, no strangers tramping through your personal space." "We understand this must be emotional," Patricia added, her voice soft with manufactured sympathy. "Letting go of a family home never easy, but sometimes what feels like loss is actually liberation." Liberation. I thought about the summers Michael had spent here as a boy, learning to fish from the dock, building forts in the woods behind the house. I thought about Margaret reading on the deck while the sun set over water that reflected the sky like polished metal. Liberation from what? "The maintenance alone must be overwhelming," Jennifer said, speaking for the first time since they'd arrived. "The roof needs work, the dock should be rebuilt, and the septic system is probably due for replacement. You're looking at $30,000 or $40,000 in immediate repairs." She rattled off problems with the confidence of someone who'd spent considerable time cataloging them, which meant she'd been here more than once, probably with contractors or inspectors, building a case for why I should be grateful for their rescue. "I can handle my own maintenance," I said. "I'm sure you can," Richard replied smoothly. "But should you have to? At your age, with your health considerations, wouldn't it be better to let someone else deal with these headaches?" My health considerations. Michael had been sharing information about my heart condition, probably painting me as more fragile than the medical reality. Another piece of their campaign to present me as a man who needed protection from his own poor judgment. I stood and walked to the picture window that overlooked the lake. The water was dark blue today, ruffled by wind that sent small waves against the shore. A great blue heron stood motionless in the shallows, waiting with infinite patience for the right moment to strike. "This house has been in my family for 26 years, I said without turning around. "My wife and I bought it when Michael was 12. We spent every anniversary here, every holiday we could manage. She planted the garden you can see from this window. I built the deck, the dock, most of the furniture. It's not just a property to us. It's our life's work." "Was your life's work?" Michael corrected gently. "Mom's gone, Dad. Holding on to this place isn't going to bring her back." I turned to face them, these 4 people who had invaded my sanctuary, to explain why I should be grateful to lose it. "You think I don't know she's gone?" "We think you're stuck," Jennifer said, her mask of politeness slipping slightly. 3 years is long enough to grieve. Normal people move on." Normal people. The phrase hung in the air like an accusation. I wasn't normal because I wanted to keep the home where I'd been happiest. I wasn't normal because I refused to treat my wife's memory like outdated furniture to be discarded for something more fashionable. "Here's what we're proposing," Richard said, pulling a folder from his briefcase with the efficiency of a man who'd done this before. "Fair market value plus 20%. Cash closing within 30 days. We handle all the paperwork, all the inspections, all the details. You walk away with a substantial check and no more maintenance headaches." He spread the papers across Margaret's coffee table. Purchase agreements, property assessments, financing documents, all professionally prepared, all requiring only my signature to transfer ownership of 26 years of memories to people who saw them as square footage and lake frontage. "And after we close," Patricia added, with the kind of smile that never reached the eyes, "you're welcome to visit any time. We understand the sentimental attachment. Visit my own house, at their discretion, when convenient for their schedule." I looked at Michael, really looked at him, the boy who'd helped me install the kitchen cabinets, who'd held the flashlight while I rewired the electrical panel, who'd carved his initials in the oak tree beside the house when he was 14. That boy was gone, replaced by this stranger who could stand in our family's refuge and negotiate its sale like a commodity. "Get out," I said quietly. "Dad, all of you, get out of my house." Richard's smile faltered. "Thomas, I think you're being hasty. This is an excellent offer. It's an excellent offer for a house that's not for sale to people who aren't welcome here." Patricia stood, her composure cracking slightly. "Mr. Harrison, we're trying to help you. Your son is concerned about your welfare, your ability to maintain properties of this size." "My son," I interrupted, "is concerned about his inheritance. There's a difference." The room went silent, except for the tick of the mantel clock and the distant sound of wind in the pine trees. Jennifer's face had gone pale. Michael's jaw was clenched tight enough to crack teeth. The Caldwells looked toward the door, as if calculating escape routes. "You're making a mistake," Michael said finally, his voice cold and measured. "You can't live in the past forever. Mom's gone. This house is just wood and stone now. It doesn't mean anything." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stepped toward him, close enough to see my own reflection in his eyes, close enough to speak quietly and still be heard clearly. "This house is where your mother and I chose to be happy together. It's where we brought you every summer so you could swim and fish and learn that there is more to life than what you can buy with money. It's where she sat on the deck during her last good summer, planting the flower garden she'd never see bloom because she wanted something beautiful to grow here after she was gone." My voice was steady, but my hands were shaking. "If you think that doesn't mean anything, then you're not the man I thought I raised." Michael's face flushed. "And if you think clinging to empty rooms is going to honor her memory, then you're not the man she married." The silence that followed was absolute. Outside, a loon called across the water, its voice wild and lonely. Inside, 4 people stared at me as if I'd just revealed myself to be something they hadn't expected. I walked to the front door and opened it wide. "Leave, now, and don't come back unless you're invited." They filed out without another word. I watched from the window as they climbed into their expensive cars, the Caldwells' body language stiff with indignation and disappointment. Michael paused before getting into his BMW, looking back at the house with an expression I couldn't read. Then they were gone, leaving only the scent of expensive perfume and the echo of words that couldn't be taken back. I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the weight of what had just happened. My son had looked me in the eye and asked me to give up everything Margaret and I had worked for, everything we'd cherished, so he could profit from the transaction. He'd brought strangers into our sanctuary to price our memories and explain why I should be grateful for their generosity. But more than that, he'd used Margaret's death as leverage, suggesting that holding on to what we'd built together was somehow disrespectful to her memory. The cruelty of it took my breath away. I walked through the house slowly, room by room, seeing it with new eyes. The kitchen where Margaret had made blueberry pancakes every Sunday morning, the smell of bacon and coffee filling the air while NPR played softly on the radio. The bedroom where we'd slept with the windows open, listening to loons and nightbirds and the gentle lap of water against the shore. The deck where we'd shared evening cocktails and talked about everything and nothing, her hand warm in mine as the sun painted the sky in impossible colors. This wasn't just wood and stone. This was love made manifest, happiness given form and substance. This was the place where Thomas and Margaret Harrison had grown old together, where they'd created something beautiful that was meant to last. I sat in Margaret's chair as darkness fell, watching the lake disappear into shadow. Across the water, lights flickered on in other houses. Families settling in for the evening, children doing homework, couples discussing their days. Normal people living normal lives, unburdened by the kind of betrayal that left you questioning everything you thought you knew about the people you loved. Tomorrow, I'd call Marcus and tell him to start drafting the trust documents immediately. I'd contact Dr. Williams about scheduling those cognitive evaluations. I'd begin building the legal fortress that would protect what Margaret and I had created from the son who saw it only as an asset to be liquidated. But tonight, I just sat with the weight of it all, holding Margaret's photograph and wishing she were here to tell me what came next. Because for the first time since her death, I felt truly alone. Not just widowed, but orphaned by a living son who'd decided I was no longer worth calling family. The grandfather clock in the main room chimed 11 times. Outside, the wind picked up, sending waves against the shore with more force than before. Change was coming. I could feel it in the air, in the set of my shoulders, in the steel that had entered my spine somewhere between "you're not family anymore" and "get out of my house." My son had drawn his line in the sand. Tomorrow, I'd start drawing mine, and unlike his, mine would be built to last. The morning after I threw Michael and the Caldwells out of the lake house, I woke with the kind of clarity that comes after a sleepless night spent thinking. The kind of clarity that cuts through confusion like a blade through soft wood, revealing the grain beneath. I lay in the darkness for a few minutes, listening to the house breathe around me, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months: purpose. By 6:30, I was dressed and sitting at Margaret's old desk in the study, a room she'd claimed for paying bills and organizing our lives with the precision of a military quartermaster. Her filing system was still intact, tabs labeled in her neat handwriting, documents sorted by importance and frequency of use. I pulled out the folder marked Lake House and spread its contents across the desk. Property deed, clear title in my name since Margaret's death. Insurance policies, current and fully paid. Tax records showing consistent, timely payments. Maintenance receipts for every repair and improvement over the past 26 years. A paper trail that documented responsible ownership and sound financial management. But papers, I knew, were only as strong as the person willing to fight for them. At 8 o'clock sharp, I called Marcus Henley. "Tom," his voice carried the gravel of too many years and too much coffee. "I was hoping you'd call. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. I need those trust documents drafted immediately, today if possible." "That's aggressive timing. Are you feeling pressure?" I told him about the visit to the lake house, about the Caldwells' offer, about Michael giving away keys to property he didn't own. Marcus listened without interruption, but I could hear him taking notes. "They're moving faster than I expected," he said when I finished. "That suggests either desperation or confidence that you won't resist. Either way, it's not good for you. What's my best defense? Multiple layers. First, we establish a revocable living trust with you as trustee. That puts your properties under legal protection while maintaining your complete control. Second, we document your competency with current medical and psychological evaluations. Third, we create a paper trail showing any attempts at coercion or manipulation. How long? For basic protection, I can have documents ready for signature by end of business today. For comprehensive security, we'll need a week. I thought about Michael's urgency, about the 20% premium the Caldwells were offering, about the way Jennifer had cataloged the house's supposed deficiencies with professional thoroughness. Start with the basics. I'll be there at 10. The drive to Marcus's office took me through downtown, past the diner where Margaret and I had shared coffee every Saturday morning for 15 years, past the bookstore where she'd special ordered mysteries by authors I'd never heard of, past the hardware store that had supplied materials for every project I'd ever tackled. Normal places where normal people conducted normal business, unburdened by family warfare. Marcus's office occupied the second floor of a brick building that had housed lawyers for 60 years. The waiting room smelled like old leather and older coffee, with law books that looked well used rather than decorative. When his secretary showed me in, Marcus was already spreading documents across his conference table. "Revocable living trust," he said, pointing to the first stack. "This transfers legal ownership of your properties to the trust, with you as sole trustee. You retain complete control during your lifetime, but it makes the assets much harder to challenge or manipulate. And if someone tries to have me declared incompetent, they'd have to prove you're unable to serve as trustee, which requires a much higher legal standard than simple guardianship proceedings. Plus, the trust includes successor trustees of your choosing." I reviewed the documents page by page, asking questions about language I didn't understand, making sure I knew exactly what I was signing. Margaret had always insisted on reading contracts thoroughly, no matter how much the other party wanted to rush. "Details matter, Tom," she'd say. "The devil lives in the fine print." By noon, I'd signed everything. The lake house and my family home were now assets of the Thomas and Margaret Harrison Family Trust, protected by legal structures that would make Michael's schemes considerably more difficult. "One more thing," Marcus said as we finished. "I want you to consider making this irrevocable." "What's the difference?" "With a revocable trust, you can change your mind, dissolve it, transfer assets back to personal ownership. With an irrevocable trust, the protection is permanent. No one, not your son, not his wife, not a court, can force you to undo it." The permanence of it appealed to me. Like pouring concrete foundations, once it's set, it would hold whatever was built on top of it. "Do it," I said. While Marcus prepared the irrevocable trust amendments, I drove to Henderson Electronics, a small shop downtown run by a former Navy communications specialist named Dave Henderson. Dave was maybe 50, with the kind of technical knowledge that came from years of making complex systems work in impossible conditions. "Tom," he said, looking up from a circuit board he had been soldering, "don't see you much these days. What can I do for you?" "I need a security system. Something comprehensive but discreet. Cameras, motion sensors, remote monitoring capability." His eyebrows rose slightly. "Everything all right?" "I want to know who's coming and going at my properties, especially when I'm not there." Dave nodded, without asking more questions. Military men understand the difference between paranoia and prudent preparation. We spent an hour discussing options: wireless cameras disguised as outdoor fixtures, motion sensors that could distinguish between humans and wildlife, a central monitoring system I could access from my phone. "How soon do you need this installed?" "Yesterday would be good. Today would be acceptable," he grinned. "I like a man who knows what he wants. I can have the lake house wired by tomorrow afternoon, your place in town by the weekend. What would you do in this father's situation? Let us know your thoughts below." That evening, I sat in my garage with a yellow legal pad, planning like I used to plan construction jobs. Phase 1, legal protection, completed. Phase 2, physical security, in progress. Phase 3, documentation and evidence gathering, ongoing. But there was a Phase 4 taking shape in my mind. Something Margaret would have called making sure they understand the consequences of their choices. I thought about the Caldwells' confident assumption that I'd accept their offer. I thought about Jennifer's casual dismissal of my emotional attachment to the property. I thought about Michael's willingness to give away keys to my house as if it already belonged to him. They were treating me like an obstacle to be managed rather than a person to be respected. That was their first mistake. Their second mistake was underestimating what a man with 40 years of construction experience could accomplish when properly motivated. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Jim Kowalski had been my foreman for 15 years before starting his own construction company. He'd specialized in custom work, the kind of detailed, precise installations that required more skill than speed. "Jim, it's Tom Harrison. I need a favor." "Tom, Jesus, how long's it been? What can I do for you?" "I need some work done at the lake house. Electrical modifications, some custom installations, the kind of work that requires discretion and creativity." There was a pause. "You planning something interesting?" "You could say that. Can you meet me there tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock? "I'll be there. And Tom, if this is what I think it is, I'm looking forward to it." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet garage, surrounded by tools that had built half the custom homes in the county, thinking about the conversation that would happen tomorrow. Jim would understand what I was planning without needing detailed explanations. He'd seen enough property disputes over the years to know that sometimes legal protection wasn't enough. Sometimes you needed more creative solutions. The phone rang again, Michael's number. I let it go to voicemail, then played the message back. Dad, the Caldwells are very disappointed by today's meeting. They're reasonable people trying to make a fair offer. Don't let pride cost you this opportunity. Call me back so we can discuss this rationally. Rationally, as if my refusal to sell was evidence of mental decline rather than the natural response of a man protecting what he'd built. I erased the message and went back to my planning. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline light that made every surface sharp and distinct. I was at the lake house by 7:30, coffee in a travel mug, watching the mist rise from water that reflected the sky like dark glass. Jim arrived precisely at 8, driving the same battered pickup he'd owned for 20 years. He climbed out with the easy movement of a man whose body had adapted to physical work. Toolbox in one hand, coffee cup in the other. "Tom," he said, looking around at the property with the appraising eye of someone who understood construction and craftsmanship. "Hell of a nice place. Shame someone's trying to take it from you. You heard about that? Small town, big mouths. Word is your boy's married into the development business." He set his toolbox down on the deck. "What exactly are we doing here?" I outlined my plan. Smart home integration, they'd call it in the advertisements. Automated systems that could be controlled remotely, that could make life easier for the homeowner. But with the right programming, those same systems could make life very uncomfortable for unauthorized visitors. Motion-activated lighting that strobes instead of glows, I explained. Water systems that turn on automatically when sensors are triggered. Sound systems that can play discouraging messages. Jim's grin was slow and appreciative. Home security with personality. I like it. We spent the morning mapping the house's electrical system, identifying locations for sensors and controls. Jim brought out equipment I'd never seen before. Wireless modules that could control lights, water, sound, and temperature from a central hub. Professional grade gear that looked simple but had been designed for complex applications. Military surplus, he explained when I asked about the sophisticated electronics. Government contracts ended, equipment got sold to private contractors. Lucky for us, uncomfortable for anyone who tries to break into your house. By afternoon, the installation was underway. Motion sensors disguised as smoke detectors went in every room. LED lights replaced standard bulbs, but these could strobe in patterns that would be disorienting rather than illuminating. The water system got new controls that could activate every faucet, every shower, every toilet in the house simultaneously. The sound system was Jim's masterpiece. Speakers no bigger than quarters, hidden behind outlet covers and ventilation grates, capable of producing everything from whispers to air horn blasts. The programming was elegant in its simplicity, escalating responses to continued presence, customizable messages, and remote activation from my phone. "What kind of messages you want programmed?" Jim asked as he tested the connections. I thought about Margaret's voice, about the authority she could project when Michael was testing boundaries as a teenager, firm but not harsh, disappointed rather than angry. "Unauthorized presence detected," I said. "Please leave immediately. This property is under surveillance. You are trespassing." Jim typed the message into his control tablet. "Want to add anything more personal?" "Not yet, but make sure I can update the messages remotely. Already programmed. You can record new ones from your phone, upload them to the system. Very user-friendly." As the afternoon wore on, the lake house transformed from a vulnerable target into something more like a fortress. Not obviously. From the outside, nothing looked different. But every room now contained hidden defenses, waiting to respond to unwelcome visitors with precision and persistence. "Final test," Jim said as we finished the installation. He handed me my phone, now loaded with the control app. "Walk through the house like you don't belong here." I stepped outside and came back through the front door. Immediately, lights began flashing in sequence. Living room, kitchen, hallway, bedrooms. The message played from hidden speakers. "Unauthorized presence detected. Please leave immediately." Water began running in the kitchen sink, then the bathroom, building to a crescendo that would be impossible to ignore. "Turn it off," Jim said, grinning. Unless you want the neighbors calling the cops. I tapped the phone screen, and everything went silent. The transformation was instant and complete, from chaos back to normal in the space of a heartbeat. Remote monitoring's active too, Jim added. Any motion inside the house when the system's armed, you'll get an alert on your phone. Live camera feeds, audio recording, full documentation of who shows up and when. I walked through the rooms one more time, seeing familiar spaces that now held invisible teeth. Margaret would have been fascinated by the technology, worried about the necessity. She'd always preferred solving problems with conversation rather than confrontation. But Margaret had never dealt with a son who saw her final resting place as an investment opportunity. "What do I owe you?" I asked Jim as we packed up his equipment. "Nothing. Call it a favor for an old friend. Besides," he grinned, "I've been wanting to try some of this gear in a real-world application. You're doing me a service." As he drove away, I stood on the deck watching the sunset over water that had witnessed 26 years of family happiness and 3 years of widowed solitude. Tomorrow, Michael and Jennifer would probably return with new arguments, new pressure tactics, new attempts to make me see reason. They'd find a house that was very different from the one they remembered. I armed the security system from my phone, watching as tiny red lights flickered to life throughout the house. Then I locked the door and drove home, feeling something I hadn't experienced since Margaret's death: anticipation. My son thought he was dealing with a grieving old man who'd eventually capitulate to logic and pressure. He was about to discover that grief and age didn't necessarily mean weakness, and that some foundations, once properly built, were designed to withstand any storm. The first test of my new security system came sooner than expected. I was at home, 3 days after the installation, sitting in the garage with a cup of coffee and Margaret's old crossword puzzle book, when my phone buzzed with an alert. Motion detected at the lake house. I pulled up the camera feed and watched Michael's BMW pull into the driveway, followed by that familiar silver Cadillac. They'd brought reinforcements. I counted 6 people climbing out of the 2 cars: Michael and Jennifer, the Caldwells, and 2 others I didn't recognize, a woman in a business suit carrying a briefcase, and a man with the bearing of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. The cavalry had arrived, armed with whatever legal or financial pressure they thought would finally break my resistance. I watched through the live feed as Michael approached the front door, key in hand. For a moment, he paused, probably noticing that the lock looked different. Jim had upgraded it to a smart lock that could be controlled remotely, but the key still worked, a deliberate choice on my part. I wanted them inside. The motion sensor triggered the moment they crossed the threshold. Every light in the house began strobing, not the gentle pulse of a nightclub, but sharp, disorienting flashes that would make it impossible to focus. The sound system activated with a calm but firm voice. "Unauthorized presence detected. This property is under surveillance. You are trespassing." Through the camera feed, I watched chaos unfold. Michael stumbled backward, one hand shielding his eyes from the flashing lights. Jennifer screamed and grabbed his arm. The Caldwells froze in the doorway, mouths open in shock. The 2 strangers, lawyers probably, looked around wildly as if expecting armed guards to emerge from the walls. "What the hell?" Michael's voice was clear through the audio feed. The water systems activated next. Kitchen faucets roared to life, followed by bathroom sinks, showers, and toilets. The sound was overwhelming, a mechanical symphony of rushing water that would make conversation impossible. "Get out!" Patricia Caldwell shrieked, covering her ears. "Something's wrong with the house!" But the best was yet to come. As they stumbled toward the door, the sound system shifted to phase 2, a message I'd recorded in my own voice, calm and measured despite the chaos around it. "Michael, you were told not to return without invitation. You chose not to listen. Actions have consequences, son. Some lessons are harder to learn than others." They fled, all 6 of them, stumbling over each other in their haste to escape the house that had turned against them. I watched them pile into their cars, Richard Caldwell shouting something at Michael, while Jennifer pressed herself against the BMW's passenger window like she was trying to disappear. The BMW reversed so quickly that gravel sprayed across the Cadillac's windshield. Both cars disappeared down the driveway faster than the speed limit allowed, leaving my property blessed quiet once again. I tapped the phone screen, disarming the system. The house returned to normal as if nothing had happened. Just a peaceful lake house on a Tuesday afternoon, its secrets hidden behind walls that looked innocent as childhood. My phone rang within minutes. "What did you do?" Michael's voice was shaking with rage and something else. Fear, maybe, or the dawning realization that his father wasn't the helpless old man he'd been counting on. "I protected my property from trespassers," I said calmly. "We weren't trespassing. I have a key." "You have a key I never gave you permission to use. There's a difference." "Dad, this is insane." The house went crazy, lights flashing, water everywhere, voices. "Sounds like a malfunction. Old houses can be unpredictable that way." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. When he spoke again, his voice was different, colder, more calculated. "I know what you did. I know you set this up." "I don't know what you mean." "The hell you don't. This is harassment, Dad. Booby-trapping a house, setting up systems to assault people. There are laws against this." I almost laughed. "Assault? Michael, that was a smart home security system. Very popular these days. Automated responses to unauthorized entry. Nothing illegal about protecting your property with modern technology. We'll see about that. Jennifer's calling her lawyers right now." "Good. Tell them to research property rights and home security regulations. They'll find I'm well within my legal authority to protect my house however I see fit." The line went dead. I set the phone down and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at Margaret's garden, where late roses still bloomed despite the October chill. Somewhere in the distance I could hear the rumble of a freight train, a sound that used to comfort me as a child, the rhythm of commerce and movement and things getting done. 20 minutes later, my phone rang again. Unknown number. "Mr. Harrison, this is David Caldwell, Richard's son. I'm an attorney specializing in elder law and property disputes." Of course he was. The family business expanded beyond real estate development into the legal pressure needed to make reluctant sellers see reason. "Mr. Caldwell, I don't believe we have anything to discuss." "I think we do. What happened at the lake house today could be construed as assault, harassment, perhaps even elder abuse if you're not thinking clearly about the consequences of your actions." Elder abuse. They were turning the tables, painting me as the aggressor rather than the victim. It was a clever move, and I had to admit a certain professional admiration for the strategy. "I'm thinking very clearly," I said. "Clear enough to know that someone who enters my property without permission is trespassing, regardless of whether they have a key. Mr. Harrison, I think there's been a misunderstanding about the family's intentions. They're genuinely concerned about your welfare. Their concern is noted and rejected. Good day, Mr. Caldwell." I hung up before he could respond. Within an hour, I'd received 3 more calls from numbers I didn't recognize, probably other family members or associates, all wanting to discuss reasonable solutions and everyone's best interests. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I called Marcus. "They're lawyering up," I told him. "David Caldwell, probably others. They're trying to flip the script, make me look like the aggressor." "Expected," Marcus said calmly. "Document every contact, every threat, every attempt at intimidation. If they want to paint this as a competency issue, we'll show exactly who's been reasonable and who hasn't." That evening, I drove back to the lake house to check the system and collect any evidence of the day's invasion. The cameras had recorded everything. Their shocked faces, their panicked flight, their obvious preparation for what they'd expected to be a routine intimidation session. But more importantly, the system had worked exactly as designed. No one had been hurt, nothing had been damaged, and no laws had been broken. Just an automated response to unauthorized entry, as legal as a burglar alarm and twice as effective. I was reviewing the footage on my phone when I noticed something interesting. In the moments before they had fled, I could see David Caldwell, the lawyer, examining the walls and ceiling, as if trying to identify the source of the effects. Professional curiosity, perhaps, or the beginning of a plan to disable my defenses. Either way, it told me they'd be back. I spent an hour walking through the house, checking that everything was exactly as Margaret and I had left it. Her books still lined the shelves in the bedroom, her reading glasses still lay on the nightstand beside a novel she'd never finish. The quilt she'd been working on still waited in her sewing basket, needles and thread ready for hands that would never return. This wasn't just property. This was a marriage made manifest, love translated into timber and stone and glass. Every room held stories only I remembered, the sound of her laughter echoing from the kitchen, the rustle of pages turning as she read by the fireplace, the soft whisper of her voice when she'd thought I was asleep. They wanted to take all of that and reduce it to cash, to transform a sanctuary into a transaction. But they'd forgotten something important. Sanctuaries, once properly protected, have a way of protecting themselves. I armed the security system and locked the house, but not before leaving a small gift on the kitchen counter, a framed photograph of Margaret and Michael taken here when he was 16, both of them laughing at some joke I'd been too slow to capture. In the photo, his arm was around her shoulders, and his face held the kind of pure joy that can't be faked or bought. Let them explain to their lawyers how they plan to profit from the sale of that boy's happiness. The drive home took me past the cemetery where Margaret rested under a simple granite headstone we'd chosen together during her final weeks. I pulled over, even though visiting hours were officially over, and sat in the truck looking across the darkness toward where I knew she lay. "They came back today," I said aloud, feeling only slightly foolish for talking to the night air. "Brought lawyers this time. They're getting serious about taking the house." The wind stirred the pine trees that bordered the cemetery, sending shadows dancing across headstones that marked other people's endings, other families' losses. But I didn't feel sad anymore. Not the way I had during those first raw months after Margaret's death. I felt focused. "Don't worry," I continued, starting the engine. "I've got this handled. They think they're dealing with a lonely old man who'll cave under pressure. They're about to learn otherwise." Back home, I updated my legal pad with the day's events. Phase 2 was complete and successful. Phase 3, documentation, was accumulating evidence faster than I'd expected. Michael's increasingly desperate phone calls, the lawyer's threats, the family's assumption that intimidation would work where persuasion had failed. All of it was building a case that Marcus could use if this escalated to court proceedings. But I was hoping it wouldn't come to that. I was hoping that tomorrow would bring the kind of clarity that only comes when people realize they've misjudged their opponent. My phone buzzed with a text message from Michael. "Dad, this has gone far enough. We're coming to the house tomorrow morning to discuss this face-to-face. Be there at 10 a.m. I read it twice, then typed back a single word: no. His response came immediately. "This isn't a request." I set the phone aside and walked to Margaret's chair, where I could see the first stars appearing over our neighborhood. Somewhere in the distance, that freight train rumbled again, carrying cargo toward destinations unknown. Tomorrow would bring the real confrontation, the moment when my son and his allies would discover that some men become more dangerous, not less, when they're backed into corners they've built with their own hands. The confrontation came at 10 the next morning, though not as I expected. Instead of Michael and his lawyers showing up at my door, Marcus called. "Tom, sit down. Your son filed for emergency guardianship. Claims you're mentally incompetent, citing the lake house incident as proof." The words hit like a sucker punch. Guardianship would give Michael control over my finances, health care, even where I lived. Marcus reassured me, "We've prepared for this. I'll file a counter motion today with your medical evaluations, the trust, and records of their harassment. But until Friday's hearing, you must be the picture of reason. No more traps or confrontations." I hung up, shaken. Michael wasn't just after property now. He was after my autonomy. By noon, I'd made a decision Marcus would call reckless. I drove to the Veterans Foundation, where Margaret had once volunteered. Sarah Martinez greeted me warmly. "Sarah, I want to deed the lake house to the foundation, a retreat for veterans and their families." She was stunned, but we worked through the paperwork. The donation secured tax benefits, gave me lifetime use rights, and, most importantly, placed the house beyond Michael's reach. By giving it away, I kept it. That evening, my phone filled with messages. Michael, Jennifer, the Caldwells, cycling from confusion to fury. Michael's final words: "You've destroyed this family." But I wasn't destroyed. I was free. Friday's hearing felt like theater. Michael's lawyers painted me as paranoid and unstable. Marcus calmly presented my medical reports, financials, and the threatening voicemails. "This is not a man in decline," he told the judge. "This is a competent property owner resisting exploitation." The judge denied Michael's petition on the spot. "You may disagree with your father's choices," she said, "but disagreement is not grounds for guardianship." Case dismissed. Outside, Michael confronted me. "That property was supposed to be my inheritance." "An inheritance," I said, "comes after death. I'm still alive." His face flushed. "We'll appeal." "No, you won't. There's nothing left to take." I walked away, leaving him on the courthouse steps with his empty briefcase. Driving home, I passed the foundation. Sarah was hanging a banner for the new retreat, her smile bright with relief. At home, I ate grilled cheese and tomato soup and read in the paper about the donation. Margaret would have loved seeing her name tied to something good. That night, in her chair by the window, I watched the first stars appear. The silence felt different now, not empty, but peaceful. I thought of Michael, the boy he was, the man I hoped he'd be, and the stranger he became. I couldn't change him, but I could choose my response. Dignity over resentment, boundaries over bitterness. Comment below. Do you think this father did the right thing? The following week, I began rebuilding life on my own terms. I painted the porch, cleaned the garage, and planted tulips and daffodils in Margaret's garden. On Saturday, I drove to the lake house for the foundation's first retreat. 5 veterans and their families sat on the deck, children splashing in the shallows as the sun sets over the glassy water. I didn't stay long. It wasn't my retreat anymore. It belonged to those who knew what it meant to fight for something worth keeping. Driving away, I felt a rare spark. Purpose beyond grief, meaning beyond memory. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from Michael. Not legal threats, just a handwritten page that almost sounded like an apology. Dad, I know you'll probably never forgive me, but in that courtroom, watching you outsmart people who thought they were above you, I remembered why I used to be proud to be your son. Maybe one day I'll find that person again. I read it twice, then filed it where Margaret once kept her letters. Not forgiveness, just acknowledgement that some stories don't end cleanly, that relationships often live in the space between love and loss. That night, I sat on the porch swing Margaret and I had shared for 20 years, listening to October wind in the maples she planted. The motion light glowed over the driveway, my old Ford beside her flower beds. I was where I belonged, living the life I chose, not the one others tried to impose. Not the future I'd imagined with Margaret or with Michael as a boy who believed some things weren't for sale. But it was mine, earned, protected, not surrendered. The grandfather clock struck 9. In the distance, a freight train rumbled through the valley. I finished my coffee, locked up, and prepared for night. In the bedroom, I paused at Margaret's anniversary photo from the lake house. She smiled as if everything would somehow work out. We kept it, I whispered. Not the way we planned, but we kept it, and it will help people just like you wanted. The picture stayed silent, but I knew what she would say. Beauty is honored by being shared. I turned off the lamp and lay in darkness, the house settling around me. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, for the first time since her death, I felt like myself again. Thomas Harrison, who had built and defended something lasting, and perhaps, in the end, enough was more than most people ever have.